I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, convincing myself it would be a peaceful escape from the constant noise of city life. I packed my bag meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, flashlight, extra batteries, and a first aid kit. I even included a small journal and pen, thinking I might write down my thoughts under the stars. I wanted this trip to be perfect, calm, and restorative. What I didn't realize was how easily perfect plans could unravel when you were alone in the woods. I arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine and wet earth, the way it always does after a recent rain. I checked the trail map once more, feeling a little thrill of independence, then hoisted my backpack and started walking along the narrow, winding path. The forest around me was thick, the trees tall and shadowy, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. My heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from the strange mix of excitement and solitude that came with being completely alone in the wilderness. I walked for about an hour before I found what looked like a safe, flat spot to set up my tent. There were no other campers nearby, and the spot was tucked slightly into a small clearing, surrounded by trees that made the place feel hidden and private. I started unpacking, spreading out the tent and anchoring it to the ground. The sounds of the forest were all around me: birds settling in for the night, leaves rustling with the wind, and the occasional distant snap of a branch. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. After setting up, I decided to make a small fire. The day had been long, and the idea of cooking some food while the fire crackled was comforting. I gathered dry sticks and twigs, carefully building a small stack in the fire pit I had cleared. The first few sparks made me tense, but soon enough the flames were alive, dancing and warming my hands. I cooked a simple dinner of canned beans heated in a small pot, savoring the smell and the feeling of normalcy. I ate slowly, letting my senses absorb the quiet forest around me. As the light dimmed and darkness fully settled in, I realized how alone I truly was. The world beyond the trees didn't exist here, and for the first time, I felt both exhilarated and unnervingly small. After dinner, I cleaned up and crawled into my tent, feeling a comforting weight of sleepiness. I had my flashlight and a backup battery by my side and my journal open in case I felt like writing. But exhaustion and the strange stillness outside my tent made it difficult to focus. I lay on my sleeping bag, listening intently to the forest, when I noticed something odd. A faint rustling sound coming from beyond the edge of the clearing. At first, I told myself it was just a small animal, a raccoon or a deer maybe, and tried to focus on my breathing. But then I heard it again, something dragging or shuffling over the leaf-covered ground. My stomach clenched. The sound was deliberate, heavier than a small animal, and it seemed to be moving closer. I sat up slightly, heart pounding, and held my flashlight ready. I didn't want to leave the tent, but I also knew I couldn't stay frozen forever. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again just at the edge of the clearing. I tried to steady myself, thinking logically. Bears were possible in this area, though attacks were rare. Coyotes? Maybe. But something about the noise felt wrong, more human-like than animal. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, and I realized how unprepared I actually was for being truly alone in the forest at night. I reached for my small pocket knife, the only thing I had for protection beyond my flashlight, and tried to calm myself. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining for any other sound. Minutes passed. I stayed as still as possible, trying to listen. Then came a sudden, sharp snap of a branch very close to my tent. I froze completely. The rustling had stopped again, but the forest felt different now, thicker, darker, almost oppressive. I whispered to myself that it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the thought didn't settle my nerves. I realized I had two options: stay inside the tent and hope whatever it was moved on, or leave to investigate. Neither felt safe. I stayed in my tent, flashlight ready for what felt like hours. The rustling noises came and went, always on the edge of the clearing. My mind jumped to every horror scenario I had ever imagined, but I forced myself to think practically. I could stay calm, stay quiet, and wait until morning. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, waking occasionally to more sounds, each time my heart jumping. When dawn finally broke, soft pink and orange light filtering through the trees, I unzipped my tent carefully. Everything was quiet, peaceful again, almost normal. The forest looked harmless in the daylight, but I was hyper-aware of my surroundings. I packed up quickly, eager to leave, when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. large footprints, not quite human, leading from the edge of the clearing toward my tent and then circling around it. The prints were heavy, uneven, and fresh. Whoever or whatever had been there last night had walked right around me while I slept. My hands shook as I snapped a few photos with my phone, both for evidence and to process the reality of what had happened. I realized that luck had been on my side. The intruder hadn't disturbed me further, hadn't tried to open the tent. Somehow, I had escaped without confrontation. I didn't linger. I packed everything with trembling hands, making sure nothing was left behind. My pace quickened as I followed the trail back toward the main path, constantly looking over my shoulder. By mid-morning, I reached the parking lot, still scanning the treeline, feeling both shaken and relieved. My heart still pounded, but with every step toward my car, the feeling of safety returned. I locked the doors and sat inside for several minutes, taking deep breaths and letting the sun warm me. I didn't know exactly who or what had been near my tent, but I knew I had been lucky. That alone was enough to make me grateful for the ordinary safety of everyday life, the kind I often took for granted. By the time I drove away, I felt a strange mix of triumph and lingering anxiety. I had faced real fear and had survived it without the need for imagination or fantasy. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was also raw, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. I promised myself I would return someday better prepared, but this experience would never leave me. It had taught me the value of caution, the fragility of being alone, and the sharp awareness of life that comes only when you truly face fear. I knew I would tell this story many times, but each telling would carry the memory of those tense, quiet hours when the forest seemed alive with something just beyond sight, a reminder that survival is as much about awareness and composure as it is about luck. I went camping because I wanted to be alone, not in a dramatic way, just tired of noise, phones, people always wanting something from me. I picked a small public camping area far from the main road, somewhere surrounded by tall pine trees and dry ground. The kind of place where the air smells like dirt and leaves and everything feels quiet in a way that makes your ears ring. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my car on the side of a gravel path, and walked with my backpack until I found a flat spot near a small clearing. There were no other tents around. I actually liked that at first. I set up my tent slowly, making sure the ground was even, pressing the stakes deep because the soil was loose and dusty. The sun was still up, but it was already starting to turn orange, slipping behind the trees. I remember feeling calm, almost proud of myself for doing this alone. I laid out my sleeping bag, placed my flashlight near the zipper, and lined up my supplies neatly. Food, water, knife, phone with low signal. Everything felt normal. As it got darker, the sounds changed. During the day, there were birds and wind moving through branches. At night, it was different. Crickets, distant rustling, something moving far away that I couldn't see. I cooked a simple meal over a small fire and ate slowly, listening. I kept telling myself that all sounds in the woods feel scary when you're not used to them. I cleaned up carefully, sealed the food, and hung it from a tree, not because I was scared of animals but because it's what you're supposed to do. When I finally got into my tent, the sky was black with small patches of stars visible through the trees. I zipped the tent closed and lay on my back, staring up at the thin fabric above me. I could hear my own breathing, steady but louder than usual. I felt safe enough but not fully relaxed. That feeling stayed with me like something unfinished. Sometime later, I heard footsteps. First, I didn't panic. My brain immediately tried to explain it away. Maybe a deer. Maybe someone walking far off on a trail. The steps were slow and uneven, not heavy. They stopped, then started again. I held my breath, listening harder. The steps were closer than I wanted them to be. They circled slightly, like whoever or whatever it was wasn't moving in a straight line. I stayed completely still. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I just lay there, feeling my heart beat against my ribs. The steps stopped again, this time very close. I could hear fabric brushing against leaves. That was when my stomach dropped. Animals don't sound like fabric. I waited for something else to happen. A cough, a voice, anything that would explain it. Nothing came. Just breathing, faint but human. It was slow and controlled, like someone trying not to be heard. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to press them into my sleeping bag to keep the noise down. Minutes passed. It felt like hours. The breathing moved away slightly, then stopped. I thought maybe they had left. I started to feel foolish for being so scared. That thought didn't last long. Something touched the side of my tent. It wasn't a hit or a grab. It was light, like fingers brushing against the fabric, testing it. I could see the shape of the tent move inward slightly. I felt frozen, my whole body locked up. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. All I could think was that if I made any sound, they would know exactly where I was and how scared I was. The touch moved along the tent slowly, tracing the seam, stopping near the zipper. I could see the shadow of a hand through the fabric. It stayed there for a few seconds, then pulled away. I heard footsteps again, moving around the back of the tent this time. I don't know how long I stayed like that. My throat hurt from holding my breath. My eyes burned from not blinking. Eventually, the sounds faded into the distance. I waited much longer after that, just to be sure. When I finally reached for my phone, my fingers felt numb. There was still barely any signal. I didn't try to call anyone. I was afraid the light would give me away if they were still nearby. I didn't sleep. Not even for a second. I sat up with my back against the tent wall, holding my knife, listening to every sound. The night felt endless. Every branch snapping made my heart jump. Every gust of wind made me flinch. I kept replaying the moment when the tent moved over and over again in my head. When the sky finally started to lighten, I felt a small wave of relief. Morning doesn't make things safe, but it makes them visible. As soon as I could see clearly, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The first thing I noticed was the ground around my campsite. There were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my tent in a wide loop, then came closer. One set stopped right next to the entrance. The dirt there was disturbed, pressed down deeply, like someone had stood there for a while. My hands were shaking again, but this time I didn't try to hide it. I packed up as fast as I could, not caring if things were messy or loud. I didn't eat. I didn't clean. I just shoved everything into my bag and started walking back toward the car. Halfway there, I saw something else. A piece of fabric tied to a tree branch with a knot. It looked old and dirty, like it had been there for a long time. It wasn't a trail marker. It didn't belong there. I didn't stop to look closer. I kept walking, forcing myself not to run. When I reached my car, I locked the doors immediately and sat there for a moment, trying to breathe normally. I checked the area around me before starting the engine. No one was there. The forest looked peaceful, almost beautiful in the morning light, like nothing bad could ever happen there. I drove away without looking back. Later that day, once I was home and showered, I noticed bruises on my arms from gripping myself so hard during the night. I also realized something else. The food bag I had hung in the tree was gone. The rope was still there, cut cleanly. Animals don't cut rope. I reported it, but nothing came of it. No cameras, no witnesses, no clear evidence. Just my story and the marks in the dirt that were probably gone within hours. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't go into places where help is far away and sound doesn't travel. What scares me the most isn't what happened, but how quiet it was. How careful. Whoever was out there didn't rush. They didn't panic. They took their time and they left without being seen. That's what stays with me. Not a monster, not something unreal, but the thought that someone stood inches away from me in the dark, knowing exactly where I was, and chose not to finish whatever they came there to do. I remember the night clearly, though I wish I didn't. It started as a normal weekend camping trip, just me and a few friends somewhere far from the city, deep into the woods where the trees grew thick and the sky was a distant memory behind the leaves. The trail was long, twisting through uneven terrain, and the sun had begun to dip low, painting the forest in muted oranges and deep shadows. By the time we found a clearing to set up our tents, the air was cooler than I expected, carrying a faint, damp smell of moss and rotting leaves. We worked together to pitch our tents, hammering stakes into the soft earth, the sound echoing oddly among the dense trees. I remember the feeling of soft dirt under my fingers, small roots catching at the fabric of my pants, the faint scratch of branches against my arms as I moved around. There was a brief sense of excitement, that thrill you get when you're in a new place with no distractions, just raw nature around you. But as the sun sank lower, shadows began to stretch unnaturally, and the forest no longer felt welcoming. We built a fire at the center of the clearing. The warmth felt comforting at first, the light a small island in the surrounding darkness. I watched the flames dance, throwing shapes on the trunks of the trees, twisting them into something alive and unpredictable. It was then that I first noticed the silence of the forest. During the day, it was alive with birds and insects, the occasional rustle of a small animal. But now in the evening, it was utterly quiet. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. I remember being drawn to the edge of the clearing, where the trees thickened and shadows became almost solid. There was a faint sound like footsteps crunching over dry leaves. I stopped moving, my stomach tightening. It wasn't like the sound of deer or raccoons. These were heavier, deliberate, and at irregular intervals, almost as if someone was pacing. My mind tried to reason with itself, telling me it was probably just an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon, but the rhythm didn't match anything I knew. The hair on my arms stood on end. We ate our simple dinner of sandwiches and granola bars by the fire, but the quiet feeling lingered, growing heavier as night fell. Darkness had settled fully now, and the firelight seemed smaller, weaker. I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. Every small sound, a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, the distant caw of a bird made my heart jump. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, that the forest was simply alive in ways I wasn't used to. After a while, I decided to explore a little beyond the firelight, just a few steps into the forest. My flashlight cut through the darkness in a narrow beam, illuminating the rough bark of trees, the thick undergrowth, and the uneven ground. Then I saw it. A small, discarded piece of clothing, partially buried under leaves and dirt, like it had been there for a while. My stomach dropped. It looked like a jacket, but it was ripped and dirty, and it smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth. I held my breath, looking around, and the sense of unease doubled. Why would a jacket be here in this part of the forest with no trail or campsite nearby? I turned back to the fire, my steps quickening. My friends were laughing, unaware of the tension creeping up my spine. I tried to shake it off, but then came the sound of twigs snapping again, this time closer, unmistakably human. I froze. My heart raced. Whoever or whatever it wasn't far. The forest suddenly felt huge and suffocating, and I realized how isolated we were. Cell service had been non-existent since we left the trailhead. The nearest road was miles away. I tried to convince myself to stay calm, to rationalize, but instinct took over. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing in our spare jackets, a small first aid kit, and anything else that could serve as a shield. I whispered to my friends that we should stay near the fire, and they agreed, their laughter now quieter, more nervous. The night stretched on, long and tense. Every crackle of the fire, every distant sound made me jump. I kept scanning the treeline, flashlight in hand, looking for shadows that moved too deliberately, shapes that weren't part of the forest. Hours passed. The fire burned lower and the air grew colder. We huddled together, listening to the occasional sound of something or someone moving just out of sight. Sleep was impossible. Every instinct screamed that leaving the firelight meant danger. At some point, the sense of being watched became almost unbearable. I could feel it, a presence that didn't belong, moving carefully but deliberately in the dark. Then came the moment that terrified me the most. From the edge of the clearing, I saw a figure, crouched low, almost blending with the shadows. My first reaction was disbelief, then pure, paralyzing fear. The figure didn't move quickly. It didn't run. It watched. My friends didn't see it yet, and I didn't want to point it out, not wanting to cause panic before I was certain. But I knew what I had seen. We stayed there, silent, until the first hints of dawn began to break through the dense canopy. The forest slowly became more visible, shadows receding, and with the light came a new perspective. The jacket I had seen earlier became clearer. It was part of a small pile of items, likely left behind by someone who had been in the forest recently, maybe even watching us. The figure from the night was gone, vanished as silently as it had appeared. We didn't waste time. We packed our tents, extinguished the fire completely, and left. The walk back to the trailhead was tense but uneventful. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every bird's cry made me flinch. But as we reached the road, the sound of cars and civilization, the normal morning noises, felt like safety itself. I remember looking back at the forest, its trees now just tall, silent shapes, no longer monstrous. But I knew that night, the fear, the awareness that someone could be there watching would stay with me. Later, when we returned home, we reported the incident to the local ranger station. They told us there had been recent reports of people living illegally in the forest, trespassing, and sometimes even stalking campers. Nothing supernatural, no fairy tales. Just people hiding, taking advantage of the isolation. That knowledge didn't erase the fear, but it explained it. It made sense. It was human danger, raw and real. That night taught me a lot. I learned to respect the wilderness, yes, but more than that, I learned to trust my instincts. The sense of unease, the small details that seem unimportant at first, can be the difference between safety and danger. And though it was terrifying, we survived and we left the forest together, intact, carrying the memory of a night that felt endless, but ultimately ended with us safe, awake, and wiser. Even now, I can picture the darkness between the trees, the way shadows stretched unnaturally, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. I remember the weight of fear and the cold bite of the night air. But I also remember the relief, the sense of returning to the world I knew, the bright light of day washing away the terror. That night stays with me, but it stays as a reminder, not a haunting. It was a real danger, real fear, and the ending was clear. We survived, and that made every step, every anxious heartbeat worth it. The forest will always feel different to me now, even on sunny afternoons. But I am grateful. Grateful that instinct and careful choices kept us safe, and grateful that even in fear I learned something important. The world is unpredictable, but paying attention, staying aware, and moving carefully can carry you through the darkest, scariest nights. I had always loved the idea of camping alone, of going somewhere far away from anyone and everything, and just breathing in the quiet of the forest. That weekend, I packed my old green backpack with everything I thought I would need. A sleeping bag, a small tent, a camping stove, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a water bottle, and my small journal. I had done this before, but never alone, never this far into the woods. I told myself it was fine, that I had prepared enough, that I could handle it. The drive to the trailhead had been long, the kind of road that twists between hills and disappears behind dense patches of trees. When I finally parked my car, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the dirt path. I could feel the chill settling into the air, a thin line of cold creeping under my jacket. I hoisted my backpack and started walking. The forest was quiet at first, except for the distant sound of a creek and the occasional bird. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my nose, grounding me, making me feel alive. The hike wasn't too difficult, but by the time I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for a campsite, my legs were sore and my hands sticky with sweat from adjusting the straps of my backpack. The clearing was surrounded by thick trees, and a small stream ran along one edge. I set my backpack down, took a deep breath, and started setting up the tent. I hammered the stakes into the ground, unrolled my sleeping bag, and finally lit a small fire in the makeshift pit I cleared. The flames crackled, sending sparks into the darkening sky. I cooked some pasta on the small camping stove, the smell of it filling the little space between the trees. As I ate, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This was freedom. This was what I had wanted. But as the sun disappeared completely, leaving only the pale light of the moon and my small fire, I noticed something I hadn't expected. The forest didn't feel quiet anymore. There were sounds, small rustling noises, like branches snapping under weight, coming from just beyond the firelight. I told myself it was probably deer or raccoons. Nothing dangerous. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and tried to write in my journal, but the noises didn't stop. Around midnight, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves that wasn't like any animal I knew. It came closer, circling the clearing. I froze, straining to see beyond the firelight. My flashlight was next to me, but I didn't dare move to grab it. The crunching continued, then stopped. Then, just when I thought it was over, a low growl reached my ears. Not a dog growl, not a bear growl, but something human-like, or at least big enough to be dangerous. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would be heard over the forest noise. I thought about what I had read in survival guides. Stay calm, make yourself appear bigger, make noise. I slowly picked up a large stick from the ground, feeling its weight in my hands. I whispered to myself to stay calm, but I could feel my hands trembling. The growling moved again, circling, and then stopped. Absolute silence followed, and I realized I couldn't even hear the creek anymore. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I had no sense of time, and then I heard it. A soft thump on the edge of the clearing. My eyes darted to the movement, and I could barely make out a shadow moving between the trees. I gripped the stick tighter. My mind raced through every scenario, every story I had ever heard about people lost or attacked in the woods. The shadow stopped, and I swear I could see someone or something just standing there, watching. I knew I had to act. I couldn't stay frozen. I ran for the tent, grabbed my backpack and started unzipping my emergency whistle from the strap. I had no idea if it would work, but I blew as hard as I could. The shrill sound echoed through the trees, bouncing off branches, startling birds into the night sky. The shadow disappeared immediately, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I exhaled. My plan was to stay in the tent and wait, but then I realized my tent was only thin fabric, not a real barrier if someone had bad intentions. I remembered the creek and decided to head there. Water could help me think, give me a path to follow, maybe even a way out. I grabbed my flashlight and ran carefully, trying not to trip over roots or rocks. When I reached the creek, I realized the moonlight reflected off the water, giving me just enough light to move. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me back to the main trail. Every shadow made me jump. Every snapped branch made me freeze. My mind was racing with fear, but also with determination. I had to get out. After what felt like hours, I heard something behind me, footsteps, slow but deliberate. I turned and shined my flashlight, but the beam only hit the trees, nothing more. I broke into a run, following the creek, ignoring the pain in my legs and the screaming in my chest. Then, just as dawn started breaking, pink and orange light spilling through the trees, I saw it, the edge of a road. My heart leapt. I ran faster, emerging onto the dirt road just as a car drove by. I waved frantically, screaming. The driver slowed, pulled over, and I ran straight into their arms, trembling, shaking, soaked in sweat and dew. I explained as best I could between sobs, and the driver called the police while I sat in the warmth of the car, finally feeling some sense of safety. They didn't find anyone when they checked the woods, but I knew what I had seen, or at least what I had felt. My hands still shook when I remembered the shadow, the low growl, the feeling of being watched. By the time I got back home, exhausted and dirty, I knew I had learned something important. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was also unpredictable. Alone, you were vulnerable in ways you couldn't imagine until you experienced it. But I also learned that fear could be managed, that thinking clearly under pressure could save you. And most importantly, that listening to your instincts mattered more than anything else. I never went back to that clearing, and I never camped completely alone in the wilderness again. But I kept my backpack, my journal, and my memories. Because even in the fear, there was a strange sense of accomplishment. I had faced something I couldn't control, and I had survived it. Every time I think back, I remember the way the first light of dawn felt on my face, the relief of reaching the road, and the strength I discovered within myself when everything else was terrifying. That weekend changed the way I looked at the world. It taught me respect for nature, respect for my own limits, and the importance of preparation. I still hike, I still camp, but I never underestimate the forest again. And I never, ever forget the feeling of being alone and vulnerable and yet finding a way back to safety on my own. I remember the first time I went camping alone. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, to find some peace, and I convinced myself that a weekend in the wilderness would be perfect. I picked a remote campsite deep in the forest, the kind of place you drive for hours to reach, where cell service is a rumor and the trees feel endless. My car was packed tightly with supplies: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, water, and food. I even brought a first aid kit and a flashlight with extra batteries. I thought I had covered everything. The drive there was long and quiet. The road narrowed as I got deeper into the forest. The sunlight filtered through the trees in beams, and everything seemed calm and untouched. I could hear birds, and somewhere in the distance, a river whispered over rocks. I finally arrived at the campsite as the sun began to dip, painting the sky with pink and orange streaks. It was isolated, with only the faint marks of previous campers. I parked the car, unloaded my gear, and picked a flat spot near the edge of the small clearing. Setting up the tent was a task I usually enjoyed, but that evening the forest felt different. The shadows were long and strange, and every rustle of leaves made me pause. Still, I was determined to settle in. I pitched the tent carefully, tied down the corners, and unpacked my sleeping bag and stove. I had a small dinner of instant noodles and canned beans. The food tasted ordinary, but the air was crisp and smelled of wet earth and pine. The sky darkened quickly. By the time I was cleaning up, it was nearly night. I decided to take a short walk around the campsite before it got too dark. The forest was alive with sound: the wind through the branches, the distant snap of a twig, and something that sounded like water moving. I had brought a flashlight, but I wanted to rely on my eyes for a moment, to feel the space around me. That's when I noticed it, the sense of being watched. It started as a prickling at the back of my neck. Then I noticed the shadows moving in ways that didn't match the wind. Something or someone was out there. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Bears weren't impossible here, though they usually avoided humans. I walked back toward the tent quickly, keeping my flashlight ready. That was when I heard it. A low, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the ground. My heart rate spiked. I froze, straining my ears. The sound stopped. Then faintly I heard breathing, not animal, human. I went back to the tent, zipped it closed, and sat on my sleeping bag. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally. There was no way anyone could be out here unless they were another camper, but it was a remote spot and I hadn't seen any cars for miles. I checked my phone. No signal. My stomach sank. I realized that if someone was here, I was alone and unreachable. I had packed a small knife and kept a flashlight beside me, but that didn't make me feel much safer. Hours passed. I kept hearing small noises, branches breaking, leaves rustling, footsteps just outside my tent. Every sound made my pulse quicken. I stayed quiet, listening. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there. I considered leaving, but the forest was too dense, and the dark made it impossible to find the car safely. I decided the safest thing was to stay put, keep quiet, and hope it went away. Around midnight, the noises stopped for a while. I thought maybe it was over, that the person or animal had left. I tried to sleep but didn't close my eyes fully. Then a sudden movement caught my attention. The tent fabric shifted as if someone brushed against it. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I clutched the flashlight and knife, ready to defend myself. My mind raced with every scenario, none of them good. I stayed absolutely still, listening. It was hours of this, every little sound making me tense. Every shadow outside the tent magnified into something dangerous. I realized my food was unprotected, and if it was an animal, it might come closer. I had to make a choice. Stay in the tent and hope it went away, or try to make noise and scare it off. I decided to stay hidden. I tried to keep my breathing steady, and eventually the night stretched on in tense silence. Dawn finally came, pale and gray. I unzipped the tent cautiously and looked around. The forest was quiet. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that someone had been so close the night before. The sense of being watched lingered, but daylight brought clarity. I packed up as quickly as I could, my hands trembling slightly from the tension. As I drove out, I noticed tire tracks on the dirt road that hadn't been there the day before. They were recent, deep, as if a vehicle had passed slowly through the forest. My stomach sank, but I forced myself to keep going. I told myself maybe it was another camper who had passed by in the night, but a part of me knew it could have been something else. I never saw anyone, but the evidence of human presence was enough. I made it back to a small town a couple of hours later. I stopped at a cafe, ordered coffee, and sat quietly, trying to calm my nerves. The daylight, the normal sounds of cars and people, and the warmth of the cafe felt like safety itself. I realized that even though nothing had physically hurt me, the fear and tension of being alone in the forest had been real. The experience left me with a newfound respect for isolation, for the wilderness, and for the fact that sometimes danger doesn't need to be visible to be terrifying. That camping trip taught me more than I expected. I learned to prepare thoroughly, to respect the forest, and to trust my instincts. I didn't go back to that campsite, but I kept camping in safer areas, always aware that nature is unpredictable and humans can be too. The memory of that night stayed with me, the way the darkness felt heavier than it should, the dragging sound that I couldn't explain, and the pure, unbroken silence of dawn that made the fear both surreal and real at the same time. Even now, years later, I remember the feeling of the wind through the trees, the shifting shadows, and the way my heart pounded when every sound was amplified in the quiet. I can still picture the dark shapes beyond my tent and the way I felt small and alone in a place that seemed infinite. It was terrifying, yes, but it ended safely, with daylight and a drive back to the world of people and noise. That ending, that clear morning, gave me the confidence to face fear, to respect it, and to know that even when something seems threatening, preparation and caution can see you through. Camping alone taught me that fear is real, tangible, and sometimes invisible, but it also taught me that survival and calm come from patience, awareness, and trusting yourself. I didn't need ghosts or monsters to feel terror that night. The forest itself, the isolation, and the unknown were more than enough. And yet I survived. I learned, I drove back, and I carried the lesson forward into every adventure afterward. It became a story I would remember clearly for the rest of my life, not because of horror or fantasy, but because of the raw, real intensity of facing fear alone in the wild. By the time I finally looked back at that forest from the edge of the road, the morning sun caught the tops of the trees in a golden light. Everything seemed calm again, almost innocent, but I knew the night had revealed a side of the wilderness that few people see. I felt relief, gratitude, and a deep sense of accomplishment. I made it out. I was safe. And that ending, the long drive back in the quiet morning with the forest disappearing behind me, felt like more than just survival. It felt like understanding, learning, and carrying a story that was mine alone. The lesson stayed. Preparation, vigilance, and respect for the unknown keep you safe, even when fear is real and unexplainable. That day I left the forest, I promised myself I would never underestimate it again. And even though the memory sometimes makes my skin crawl, I feel stronger because of it, ready for any quiet, dark place that comes my way. I went camping alone because I wanted quiet and space, not adventure. I picked a random spot I found on a public land map, far from main campgrounds, far from people. The place was deep in the trees, where the road slowly turned into dirt and then into nothing but tire marks and weeds. My phone signal disappeared about 20 minutes before I reached the spot, but I told myself that was normal. I parked near a clearing and walked the rest of the way in with my backpack, tent, and food. The air smelled damp and green, like old leaves and wet soil. The trees were tall and close together, blocking most of the sky. I set my tent near a small dry stream bed. The ground looked flat enough, and there were no obvious animal tracks that I noticed at first. I was careful, slow, trying to do everything right. I laid out my sleeping bag, checked my zipper twice, and hung my food bag higher than I thought I needed to. I remember feeling proud of myself for being calm. The woods were quiet in a normal way, with birds moving around and leaves shifting. Nothing felt wrong yet. As the sun started to go down, the light changed fast. The trees made the shadows longer and darker than I expected. The temperature dropped enough that I could feel it on my arms. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove and cleaned everything carefully. I didn't want to attract animals. I kept scanning the area without really thinking about it, just letting my eyes move around while I ate. That's when I noticed something that didn't fit. About 30 or 40 feet away, behind a group of trees, there was a patch of ground that looked disturbed. The leaves were pushed aside, like someone had stood there for a while. I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer move through areas like that all the time. Still, I stared at it longer than I meant to. The woods felt quieter than before, like everything had paused. I packed up my cooking gear and moved a little faster than I had earlier. When it was almost dark, I went into my tent and zipped it up. I kept my headlamp off and just lay there listening. At first, the sounds were normal. Wind moving branches. Something small running through the leaves. Then sometime later I heard a heavier sound. It wasn't loud, but it had weight to it. A slow shift, like boots pressing into dirt. It came from the direction of the disturbed ground I had noticed earlier. My body went still on its own. I held my breath without meaning to. The sound stopped. Then it happened again, closer this time. I didn't hear any talking, no voices, nothing like that. Just movement. Whoever or whatever it was knew how to move quietly. The steps were careful, spaced out, like someone was trying not to be noticed. My heart started beating so hard I was sure it could be heard outside the tent. I kept telling myself that animals don't move like that. Animals don't stop and wait. Animals don't circle. The footsteps moved around the tent slowly, staying just far enough away that I couldn't see a shadow through the fabric. I could feel the presence, though. The air felt heavier, like pressure on my chest. At one point, something brushed against the side of the tent. Not hard. Just enough to make the fabric shift slightly. I froze completely. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't even swallow. Minutes passed like that, maybe longer. Time felt stretched and strange. The sounds eventually moved away, deeper into the trees. I stayed awake long after, staring at the dark inside of the tent, replaying every detail in my head. I told myself that if it were a person, they would have done something by now. I told myself that fear was making it worse than it really was. Sometime in the middle of the night, I smelled something strange. It was faint but sharp, like sweat mixed with metal and dirt. It didn't belong in the clean forest air. My stomach turned cold. The smell got stronger, then faded again, like someone had passed close by and then moved away. I never heard footsteps that time, which scared me more. I didn't sleep. I just waited for the sky to change color. When the first weak light of morning came through the trees, I finally unzipped the tent a few inches and looked outside. The forest looked normal again. Birds were back. The air felt lighter. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined everything. Then I saw the footprints. They were clear in the soft dirt near the tent. Boot prints. Not old. Fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. They circled my tent slowly, unevenly, like someone had taken their time walking around it. One set went closer to where my head had been while I slept. There were no animal tracks mixed in, no signs of confusion. Just human footprints. My hands started shaking so badly I had to sit down. I packed everything as fast as I could, not caring about being neat anymore. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up the site the way I had planned. I just wanted to leave. As I lifted my bag, I noticed something else. My food bag was lower than I had hung it. The rope had been loosened and retied in a different knot than the one I used. I knew my knots. That wasn't mine. I didn't run, but I walked fast, constantly looking over my shoulder. The path back to my car felt longer than before. Every sound made my muscles tense. I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree. I never did. When I finally reached my car and got inside, I locked the doors and sat there shaking for several minutes before starting the engine. As I drove away, I saw something in my rearview mirror that made my chest tighten. At the edge of the trees, far back from the road, there was a shape standing still. I couldn't see details, just the outline of a person watching the car leave. They didn't move. They didn't follow. They just stood there, half hidden by the trees, like they had been there the whole time. I didn't stop driving until I reached a town with people and buildings and noise. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors. I didn't report it. I didn't have proof, just footprints and fear. But I know what I experienced. Someone had been there. Someone had watched me sleep, close enough to touch my tent, close enough to change my things. I never camp alone anymore. I don't go off marked sites. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I still remember the sound of those slow steps and the feeling of being observed. The woods didn't do that to me. A person did. And that is what still scares me the most. The sun had just started to dip behind the tall pines when I finally found a clearing that looked like it could work for camping. My legs were sore from hiking all day and my backpack felt like it had grown heavier with every step. I dropped it onto the soft forest floor and exhaled, letting the faint smell of pine needles and damp earth fill my lungs. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Birds had stopped singing, and even the usual rustle of small animals seemed to vanish. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just the late hour. I needed to set up my tent before it got dark. I picked a flat patch of ground and began unpacking my gear. My hands shook a little, not with fear, I told myself, but just from exhaustion. The wind shifted through the trees, making the branches sway and scrape against each other in a way that sounded almost like whispering. I shrugged and ignored it, focusing on hammering the tent stakes into the ground. The air was starting to get cold and I regretted not bringing my gloves. Once the tent was set up, I decided to collect some firewood. I knew that a fire would help me feel safer, and I needed it for warmth and to cook my dinner. I wandered a few steps into the woods, looking for dry sticks and branches, trying not to notice how deep I had wandered from my campsite. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and loose rocks. My flashlight beam danced across the trees, catching the occasional glint of moss or a spider web. I found a decent pile of wood and carried it back, feeling slightly more in control. By the time I had the fire going, the sky had darkened completely. The moon was just a thin crescent, barely lighting the forest. Shadows moved in strange ways across the ground, and every snap of a twig made my heart jump. I tried to calm myself, telling myself this was all normal. The forest at night could be unsettling if you weren't used to it. I sat close to the fire, my knees pulled up to my chest, and tried to eat some of the trail mix I had brought. The crunch of the nuts and chocolate was oddly comforting in the stillness. That's when I heard it, the first sound that made my stomach drop. A low, scraping noise coming from deeper in the woods. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just a fallen branch or an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then it came again, slower this time, deliberate, as if someone or something was moving toward me. My pulse quickened. I grabbed a stick from the fire, holding it like a weapon, and scanned the darkness with my flashlight. There was nothing. I told myself to stay calm. I was alone, yes, but I wasn't stupid. I had my phone, though I didn't have much signal, and my emergency whistle was in my pocket. Still, the sound continued, moving intermittently, stopping and starting, always somewhere deeper in the trees. Every time I thought it had gone, it would start again, closer this time. I realized then that I had underestimated how isolated I was. My campsite, which had seemed cozy and secure in the daylight, now felt exposed. The trees that had looked majestic earlier now loomed like dark sentinels. I tried to listen for patterns, to figure out if it was an animal, but the noise didn't match anything I knew. It was too heavy, too controlled. My stomach twisted into knots. I decided to retreat into my tent and lock myself in for the night. As I crawled inside, I kept my flashlight in hand and set it to the lowest beam, hoping to avoid drawing attention. I tucked my knees under my chin again, feeling the cold seep through the thin ground sheet. The sound outside paused for a while, then started again. I stayed as still as I could, pretending to be asleep, hoping it would pass. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. The scraping and shifting moved around the campsite in circles. Occasionally, I thought I heard footsteps crunching the leaves closer, then retreating. I didn't dare move. My mind raced with every possible scenario. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself maybe it was a lost hiker, someone injured, or just wandering. But the weight of uncertainty was suffocating. At some point, exhaustion finally crept in. I dozed in short bursts, waking every time the noise shifted. The night felt endless, and I kept my senses straining, listening to every sound: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch under unseen weight. My mind refused to allow normal sleep, and when the first hint of dawn touched the treetops, I was relieved but still tense. When I finally stepped out of my tent, the forest looked calm, harmless in the light of day. I took stock of my surroundings carefully. I noticed that some branches had been broken at strange angles, and there were footprints I didn't recognize, large, heavy prints, not like any animal I had seen. Panic surged briefly, but I reminded myself that I had survived the night, and that was the most important thing. I packed up quickly, taking extra care not to leave anything behind. I kept my eyes peeled as I retraced my steps along the trail I had taken the day before. Every shadow made me flinch, every crack of wood made me jump, but gradually the trail began to look familiar. Birds started singing again, and the sunlight through the trees was warming my back. The world felt normal, but I knew I wouldn't forget that night. By mid-morning, I reached the small dirt road that led back to my car. My legs were stiff, and my hands were sore from gripping my backpack so tightly, but I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I loaded my gear into the trunk and sat for a few minutes, just listening to the hum of the car engine. I realized that the fear I had felt wasn't just in my head. The forest had been dangerous in its own way, and I had trusted my instincts and survived. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the thick line of trees that had contained me for a night. I promised myself I would be more careful next time, never wander off too far. Always mark your path and trust your gut when something feels off. That experience, terrifying as it was, taught me more about the wilderness than any guidebook ever could. I knew the forest hadn't been supernatural, it hadn't been a ghost or a monster. It had been real, raw, and unpredictable, and I had faced it and come out the other side. Even now, I can remember the cold, the darkness, and the scraping sounds. But I also remember the fire I built, the tent I set up, and the way the first light of day felt like a shield. That night changed me, not because of anything magical, but because I realized just how resilient I could be when I had to survive. And sometimes, that lesson is scarier and more valuable than any story with ghosts or fairy tales ever could be. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a weekend escape, just me and nature, a break from school and life in the city. I packed my old green backpack carefully the night before, checking and rechecking my supplies. Tent, sleeping bag, water bottles, extra clothes, matches, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and some snacks. I thought I was being thorough. I thought I had everything I needed. The drive up the winding forest roads was beautiful, the kind of scenery that makes your chest tighten with relief just because the air feels fresher and quieter. When I finally reached the small clearing I'd chosen for my campsite, I parked the car and climbed out, taking a deep breath. The smell of wet earth and pine needles filled my lungs. Birds were chirping in the distance, and a thin stream glittered under the late afternoon sun a little ways off. I thought it was perfect. I unpacked slowly, setting up my small orange tent with care. Every peg I hammered into the ground felt like a small victory. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I gathered some firewood nearby, scanning for dry sticks and branches. It wasn't hard to find some, but I knew I'd need more if I wanted a fire to last through the night. I stacked them neatly in a pile, telling myself I was being smart and cautious. Night came faster than I expected. The temperature dropped quickly and the woods around me grew darker and colder. I lit a small fire and watched it crackle, trying to feel comforted by the warmth. That's when I noticed the first hint of unease. The forest didn't feel alive in the usual way. No birds, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth, just the occasional snapping of a twig somewhere far away. My flashlight rested next to me and I made sure it worked, clicking it on and off. I decided to eat dinner by the fire, some sandwiches and chocolate bars. It wasn't much, but it filled me up. I ate slowly, listening to the quiet, trying to convince myself I was alone because I wanted to be. I reminded myself that the woods were safe if you stayed aware, if you respected them. Hours passed. I had been lying in my sleeping bag, staring at the fire, when I heard it. A low, heavy rustling coming from the treeline at the far edge of the clearing. My heart jumped. I froze, straining to see through the darkness. My flashlight beam swept across the trees, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure, or maybe it was just a shadow cast by the fire. My hands trembled and I told myself to calm down. There was nothing there. It was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. I decided to go to bed, telling myself I'd just brush it off as imagination. I zipped my sleeping bag and crawled into the tent, shutting the flap behind me. The fire outside still glowed dimly, but it wasn't enough to see the whole clearing. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep. That's when I heard it again, the rustling, closer this time. Something was moving near my fire. My first instinct was to stay perfectly still. I didn't want whatever it was to notice me. Then I remembered the bear spray I had tucked into my backpack, the emergency whistle clipped to my belt loop, and the small camping knife under my pillow. I told myself I was prepared. But preparation didn't stop the cold terror that ran through me when a shadow passed just beyond the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and switched it on. Its beam cut a sharp circle through the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Nothing. Just the trees, just the underbrush. Then I heard a deep, guttural growl. Not far off. My stomach dropped. My mind raced. I knew bears lived in this forest. I had read about it. The thought of one being that close made my hands shake violently. I stayed in the tent for what felt like hours, clutching my knife, flashlight by my side, listening to the sounds of the forest. The rustling didn't stop, moving around my campsite, circling. I could hear branches snapping under heavy steps. My eyes refused to close. I remembered all the safety tips I had read. Make noise, don't run, stay near your supplies. I whispered to myself over and over that I needed to stay calm, that panic would make things worse. Then, at some point in the night, I realized the fire had almost burned out. I had to relight it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely strike the match. The fire caught, finally, sending flickering shadows dancing across the clearing. And I saw it just for a second as it ducked behind a tree. A large brown bear, enormous, sniffing the air, eyes glinting in the firelight. My heart stopped. I froze, hoping it didn't notice me. Hours passed. I stayed in the tent, shaking, barely breathing. I listened to it move around the perimeter of my campsite. I didn't make a sound. I didn't dare. But I had to survive until morning. Every noise made my blood run cold. The snapping of a branch, the rustling of leaves, the heavy steps pacing near my fire. I felt trapped, completely at the mercy of this wild animal. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first hint of dawn broke through the trees. The forest lightened slowly and the bear retreated into the woods. I stayed in the tent, too scared to move until the sun fully rose. Once I was sure it had left, I stepped outside. My fire pit was destroyed, scattered, and some of my firewood had been knocked over. I could see footprints in the soft earth, enormous clawed tracks leading into the trees. I was shaking, but I knew I had survived. I packed up my campsite carefully, not daring to linger. Every sound made me jump. The walk back to my car felt impossibly long. I was constantly scanning the forest, hyper-aware of every branch, every movement. I finally reached the car, trembling but relieved. I locked the doors and sat inside, taking deep, shuddering breaths. My heart was still racing, but I felt a strange pride. I had faced the fear of being completely alone, completely vulnerable, and I had survived. Driving down the winding forest roads, I couldn't stop thinking about the night. The fear, the adrenaline, the darkness, and the helplessness, it stayed with me. But I also felt an unshakable respect for the forest and the creatures that lived there. Nature wasn't a storybook with happy endings. It was unpredictable, wild, and sometimes terrifying. I learned that the hard way. But I also learned that preparation, caution, and a clear mind could make the difference between life and death. By the time I reached my small apartment in the city, I was exhausted. I unpacked my gear and carefully cleaned my knife and flashlight, placing everything back in its proper place. The woods had scared me more than I had ever imagined, but I had survived. And in that survival, I felt a strange sense of triumph. The fear would never leave me completely, it shouldn't, but I had faced it and I had walked away. I knew if I ever went camping again, I would be smarter, more prepared, and more aware. The forest had taught me that much, and I knew that lesson would stay with me forever. I had always loved the idea of camping alone. There was something about being completely immersed in nature, away from city noise, that made me feel alive. I had planned this trip for months, mapping out a trail deep in the national forest, a place that was supposed to be quiet, remote, and untouched. I packed everything carefully: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a portable stove, food, and water. I left early in the morning, driving until the road narrowed into a dirt path and eventually disappeared entirely into a trail. By the time I parked, the sun was high, casting long shadows between the thick trees. The trail was uneven, covered with roots and rocks, forcing me to watch my steps constantly. I kept my backpack snug, feeling the weight of all my supplies pressing against my shoulders, a reminder that I was alone and responsible for myself. The further I went, the quieter it became. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, but even they seemed hesitant, cautious in the dense woods. Every now and then, a rustle in the underbrush would make my heart jump. I tried to tell myself it was just small animals, squirrels or deer. But deep down, I knew the forest was unpredictable. By late afternoon, I found a clearing near a small stream, perfect for setting up my camp. I started pitching my tent, sweating under my jacket, hands trembling slightly from nervous excitement and exertion. The forest felt alive around me, each snap of a twig under my foot echoing like a warning. The stream gurgled nearby, clear and cold, reflecting the orange hues of the setting sun. I decided to gather some firewood. Branches and logs were scattered along the banks, dry enough to catch, but I kept an ear open for any unusual sounds. As I returned to my camp with the wood, I noticed something strange: a set of footprints in the damp soil near the edge of the clearing. They were fresh, not old, and they weren't small animal tracks. My stomach tightened. The prints were irregular, and judging by the size, they belonged to a person, someone bigger than me, someone strong. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was hiding behind the trees, but the forest was dense. No one. Just me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably a hiker who had passed by earlier, but the prints didn't continue in a straight line. They ended abruptly, as if the person had crouched down or vanished into the underbrush. I decided to ignore it for now, convincing myself that panicking would only make things worse. I lit a small fire and cooked a simple meal, listening to the crackle of flames and the constant gurgle of the stream. Night fell quickly. Without the sun, the forest transformed. Shadows stretched across the clearing, and the darkness seemed thick, almost tangible. Every rustle and crack of a branch sounded louder, sharper, closer. I kept my flashlight within reach, and every few minutes I swept the beam over the trees, but I saw nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I decided to go to sleep. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, leaving a small part of the tent open to the outside air. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds: owls hooting, leaves rustling, small animals skittering across the forest floor. At first it was soothing, a reminder that life thrived here. But soon I noticed another sound, soft, deliberate, different from the usual forest noises. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They didn't sound like a deer or raccoon. My heart pounded in my chest. I froze, listening. The steps stopped suddenly, then resumed, closer this time. I didn't want to believe someone had been following me all day, but the evidence was undeniable. Whoever it was, they were moving around my camp, circling, careful not to be seen. My fingers shook as I reached for my small pocket knife, keeping it close. I thought about running, but the forest was pitch dark and I didn't know the terrain well enough to risk it. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, hoping they would leave. Time stretched endlessly. Every minute felt like an hour. The footsteps finally stopped. I held my breath, listening for anything else. Hours passed. Dawn approached, casting a faint gray light through the tent's thin fabric. I peeked outside, careful not to make a sound. There were no footprints near the tent now, only the ones from earlier that I had noticed. No one was in sight. My body relaxed slightly, but my mind refused to let go of the fear. I packed my things quickly, keeping my knife in hand, scanning the forest constantly as I moved. I needed to get back to my car to safety before anything else happened. That's when I saw it. A makeshift shelter hidden among the trees, partially covered with leaves and branches. It was crude, barely more than a lean-to, but it had clearly been used recently. Inside, I could see a sleeping bag, empty cans, and what looked like a small pile of personal belongings. The thought that someone had been living just out of my sight all along made my stomach churn. I didn't linger. I kept my head down and moved faster, following the trail I had used to get here. The forest seemed different in the morning light, less threatening but still immense. I could hear birds again, squirrels rustling, but I couldn't shake the memory of the footsteps circling my camp. I finally reached the road where I had parked. Relief hit me in waves. My car looked untouched, the keys exactly where I had left them. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine immediately, not caring about the dirt on the tires or the scratches from branches. On the drive back, I replayed everything in my mind. I knew I had been lucky. Whoever or whatever had been in the forest with me hadn't harmed me, but they had been close enough to make me feel completely vulnerable. I realized how important it was to trust instincts, to respect the unknown. Camping alone wasn't just about enjoying nature, it was about understanding that the wilderness could be unforgiving. Back home, I unpacked my things slowly, checking everything twice. The experience left me shaken but also more aware. I didn't need a ghost story to feel terror. The real fear came from knowing that someone had been so close, watching, maybe even waiting. I decided I would continue camping, but never alone again, and always with a plan to keep myself safe. Even now, when I walk in the woods or hear someone rustling in the trees, I remember that night. The fear isn't paralyzing anymore, but it's a lesson etched into my mind. The forest is beautiful, wild, and alive, but it's also unpredictable, and it reminded me in the most terrifying way that being prepared and cautious isn't optional, it's necessary. By the end of it, I had learned something vital about myself too. I had faced real fear, not in a storybook way, but in a raw, physical way. I survived because I stayed calm, observant, and aware. And for me, that was the kind of ending that mattered, the kind where I walked away alive, smarter and stronger, carrying the lesson with me, clear and undeniable. I had always loved the idea of camping alone, thinking it would be peaceful, a way to escape the noise of everyday life. I packed my small backpack carefully, making sure I had my sleeping bag, water, some canned food, a flashlight, and my little camping stove. I was prepared for a night under the stars in the woods behind the old ridge near the river. It wasn't very far from the town, but far enough that I would be completely alone. The hike up the ridge was harder than I expected. The trail was overgrown in some places, and the underbrush clawed at my legs as I pushed through. I kept telling myself it was part of the adventure, that it was supposed to feel wild and untouched. The sun was low in the sky, painting the trees orange and red, and the air smelled crisp, like the forest itself was breathing around me. I found a small clearing near the top of the ridge, just big enough to set up my tent. The view was incredible. From where I stood, I could see the river winding below, the water glinting in the sunlight. I chose that spot because it felt safe, elevated, away from any steep drops, and not too close to the dense forest where I wouldn't be able to see anything approaching. I set up my tent quickly, my fingers stiff and clumsy as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. Once the tent was up, I gathered some firewood, stacking twigs and branches carefully, making a little pile in the center of my clearing. I had a small lighter, and after a few attempts I got the fire going. The flames crackled and popped, and I felt a warmth that went beyond the heat. Sitting by that fire, I felt an initial thrill, a rush of freedom. I boiled some water for tea, took small sips, and listened to the wind rustling through the trees. As night fell, the forest transformed. What had been beautiful and inviting in the daylight became shadowed and unfamiliar. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch sounded louder. My flashlight cast long, shaky beams across the clearing, but beyond the circle of light, the trees were black masses. I felt the first thread of unease tug at me. Then I heard it, a low, heavy rustling, moving through the trees just beyond my firelight. My heart jumped and I froze. It didn't sound like a bird or a small animal. It was slow, deliberate, like something large was pushing through the brush. I tried to tell myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, something harmless, but the sound of it moving closer, inching around the clearing, made my stomach twist. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the noise, but there was nothing visible. The darkness absorbed everything, making it impossible to see more than a few feet away. The rustling continued, circling my tent, and then I heard the soft crunch of leaves on the ground, unmistakably heavy footsteps. My breath hitched. I thought about calling someone on my phone, but my battery was low and my signal was weak at best. I decided to stay calm, to keep the fire going and wait. I knew that if I ran into the woods, I could easily twist an ankle or get lost. So I huddled closer to the fire, trying to make myself feel safer, telling myself that maybe the animal would move on. But then I smelled it, a sharp, musky odor like wet fur and earth. It was close, closer than anything I had expected. My heart was hammering so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The rustling became more insistent, louder. Something was sniffing around my firewood. I remembered the small pocket knife I carried and gripped it tightly, my fingers white around the handle. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to make as little movement as possible. I could hear breathing now, heavier and uneven. I was no longer just scared, I was terrified, my body trembling, my mind racing. Then a branch snapped behind me. I whirled with my flashlight, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of a dark shape. Too big to be a deer, too heavy for a raccoon. My stomach dropped. I grabbed a stick and threw it into the underbrush, trying to scare it off. The shape bolted, crashing through the trees and disappearing into the night. I was shaking so badly that it took me several minutes to realize I was still holding the stick. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Every sound made me jump: the wind, the occasional hoot of an owl, even the small noises of my own movements. I didn't sleep. I just sat in my tent, knees pulled to my chest, fire dwindling into embers. The sense of being watched never left me. I felt like I was intruding into someone else's territory, like I had wandered into the domain of something much larger than me. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I slowly unzipped my tent. The forest looked completely different in daylight, friendly, quiet, almost serene. I stepped outside and looked around. The clearing was empty, except for a few broken twigs and flattened grass where whatever had been around had moved. My fire was just cold ash now, but the relief of seeing everything in the light was immense. I felt like I had survived something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. I packed up my things carefully, my hands still trembling, and made my way back down the ridge. Every shadow in the morning sun seemed normal, even comforting. When I finally reached the bottom and got my phone to work, I texted a friend just to say I was okay, even though nothing had happened beyond that terrifying night. As I walked back to my car, I realized how differently I now looked at the forest. It wasn't peaceful, it wasn't quiet. It was alive, and it was unpredictable. I had thought I could handle being alone, but that night had shown me the raw reality of being truly isolated in the wilderness. It had been a night of fear and instinct, of realizing how small and fragile I really was out there. Even now, weeks later, I can remember every sound, every movement. I remember the smell of the earth after rain, the rustle of leaves in the dark, the weight of fear pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. But I also remember the sunrise, the way the first light stretched over the trees and made everything look safe again. I learned something important that night. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is also untamed. Respect it and be careful. Underestimate it, and you might find yourself alone, terrified, facing things you weren't ready for. I still go camping sometimes, but I never go alone anymore. I carry extra supplies, more lights, and I make sure someone knows exactly where I am. I'm braver than I was before that night, but I'm also wiser. And whenever I see the forest now, I see it fully not as a playground for adventure, but as a living, breathing place where life and danger coexist. and where the line between calm and terror can be thinner than you think.